It was
Yeah.
almost real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast, episode 62. Hello, everyone, and welcome to It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast, where we discuss professional wrestling history from 1870 to 1930, when it was supposed to be real, but wasn't always. And joining me this week is my oldest son, Trey. I want to say hey to everybody, Trey.
Hello.
And our history topic for this week is going to be Taro Miyake and the challenge matches between the jiu-jitsu players and the pro wrestlers in England and then the United States. But as for the update this week, John, the Nebraska Tiger Man Pesic book is complete. It will be out in the early to mid-September timeframe. And I'm going to go right into my next project, which I'm hoping will be done at the middle point of December. Early December is when I'd like to get it out, but we'll see what happens. And I'll release a little bit more information about that a little bit later on. I'm just starting the project now. And something for you, Trey. I did this podcast to be a little bit more martial arts oriented since that's kind of your forte.
Yeah.
Never were a wrestling fan. So the UFC has put on YouTube a bunch of documentaries they've created about the early UFC, and it's called Fight Lore is the name of the videos, and you can just search that on YouTube and it will pop up a bunch of videos for these documentaries. I thought you might find them interesting.
Yeah. Okay.
So don't bowl me over with your enthusiasm.
Yeah. Sorry, I just got a lot to go through at this stage.
Well, so this week's topic, were you, I don't think you were on the podcast where I talked about the worked matches in Brazil. Were you
I
on that
don't think I
podcast?
was.
Yeah, I
I
didn't think
might
you
have, but
were
I don't
either.
remember it.
So basically, what I covered in that one was just like in the US, in Brazil, there were a number of challenge matches between the jiu-jitsu players and the wrestlers, and they were done for two reasons. One was to spread the art of jiu-jitsu, and in those matches were contests. But
Right.
early on, the jiu-jitsu players started working matches with the wrestlers just like in the US because one, they wouldn't get hurt, and number two, the challenge matches originally may have been to spread the martial art, but as they tried to build their schools and that, much like anywhere else, it's very difficult for someone to make a living just from teaching martial arts alone.
Right.
So while they started out being challenge matches to try to spread the um, art, they quickly became a source of revenue that the instructors needed to survive. So you kind of had the same thing develop with the judo and jiu-jitsu guys that went around the world. They would do challenge matches to spread their art, but they also needed the money to help them survive financially. And so the guy that taught the Gracies Count Combat, um, Maeda, he did those matches to make money as much as it was to spread the art of judo and jiu-jitsu. And originally, I thought most of the guys that were spreading judo and jiu-jitsu were judo black belts, but there were quite a few jiu-jitsu black belts that went out as well. And Taro Miyake is one of those guys. He studied one of the early jiu-jitsu styles that Dr. Kano studied before he created judo. And I'm still trying to get a definitive answer on this from my research. But I think at the time they started going out and spreading these styles, that judo may have just been considered another style of jujitsu. Because a lot of the judo black belts used the term jujitsu, but I thought, well, that was because the Kodokan didn't want them taking part in professional fights. But
Right.
they didn't call it judo when they were teaching it to their students either. So I'm wondering if judo and jujitsu were used interchangeably by the judo students.
It
Hopefully
wouldn't
one day I'll be
shock.
able to answer that. Yeah, well, you know how
There's a,
martial arts origin stories are. They're so obscured by so much mythology. It's really hard to get what really occurred.
right, but there's also just like when you're dealing with grappling styles, especially jujitsu and judo, there's not that big of a difference to the casual observer, and so they probably just advertised with what people knew. It's kind of like a lot of taekwondo schools and karate schools, how very interchangeably a lot of that stuff is to a casual observer,
Yeah,
and so they
and
can market it as a karate or they could switch karate or taekwondo to kind of get
well,
people's attention.
yeah. And you know, when Taekwondo first came to the United States, a lot of times they marketed it as Korean karate so people would understand what they were teaching. Now, of course, almost everybody knows what Taekwondo is because of the Olympics and that. I think it overshadows karate now.
Oh, it definitely does at this stage because karate, I think, is a lot more aggressive. Like there's a bit more of a bar to entry compared to taekwondo these days.
And it seems just a little bit more niche than it did. Now, when I was a kid, everybody was like karate, karate. But now it seems more like a niche, like kung fu. Kung fu is really a small niche. And unfortunately, judo in the United States, BJJ has really taken over the grappling scene. Judo, I think the last estimate I saw, there's like 40,000 people in the United States practicing judo. And
Yeah,
there's millions practicing jujitsu.
I will say in that regard, even with as good at martial arts as I tend to be, like just naturally, judo was one I could never fully get the hang of because of the trying to take control of your opponent in that way. Like doing every single throw is not. It's not like there's so many throws I cannot do, and so I cannot progress. But
I
like
th-
Valley Drop was the one I used the most because it was people were trying to shove me over because I'm so much smaller than them, and so I would just take them with me and then throw them over.
yeah, I found there were probably 4 or 5 throws that I was really good at, and the rest of them I could demonstrate. But it's much harder to throw somebody who's resisting you than it is to. I think it's easier to submit somebody than it is to throw them.
Right.
But that's just my opinion. I'm sure there are other people that'll say no, no, no. This, but I found the throwing to be the hardest skill probably to pick up in martial arts. Harder than the subs, harder than the ground. Much harder than striking. Most people can learn to be a competent striker. I'm not saying that that's the most effective way to defend yourself. And a matter of fact, in a lot of situations, you look like the aggressor punching somebody. Whereas when you grapple somebody, there's 2 reasons I love grappling over striking. Number one, you control how much damage is done to them when you can take them down and control them.
Yeah. Because
That's the
that's the
first.
biggest thing with men, especially if they do striking arts. I had to tell them all the time, like, you guys have to, like, you have to be absolutely certain that what you're doing is actually self-defense and that you can defend it in a court of law because you will end up getting sued for aggravated assault if it's not.
Right. You break somebody's nose, you're going to get sued and you're going to have to be able to defend it. Whereas with grappling, you can take somebody down and put them in just as much pain, but not do any lasting damage at all.
Or just reboot their computer with a rear naked choke.
Yeah. But the other thing I love about grappling is, so if you're in a stand up fight and you knock somebody out, what is the first thing they're always going to say? Oh, you just got a lucky shot.
Oh, yeah.
But when you take somebody down in grappling and you dominate, there is no excuse. They got beat, and they know they got beat. And that's why people don't like to get on the ground, because they feel like they've been emasculated when they've been controlled by somebody else. And so that's why I always preferred grappling, is because number one, you can't tell me you didn't get beat because you got beat. But number two, you control how much damage is done, and you can just take somebody down, tie them in a knot where they don't get hurt. You don't have to hurt them, and it looks much better to the average person looking at it from the outside as well.
Right.
But yeah, I agree with you on the throws. I found to be the most difficult skill. But there is a lot of research done that showed that the original judo was probably 50-50, 50% throws, 50% ground grappling. Of course, that's changed to where I would say it's now 75% stand up, 25% ground, because of the rules of judo competition. They favor standing and throwing. By the way, if you get a chance to watch any of this year's judo competition from the Olympics, it was amazing. It was the first time I wasn't bored to death watching the Olympics, because they have sped it up and made them engaged. They just can't stand there in a collar and elbow tie up forever and a day, not trying to do stuff anymore.
Right.
Some good ground stuff as well. Obviously not on the level of the BJJ competition, but some pretty good ground grapplers as well. I think they're cross training in just about everything now.
Right.
But to get back to what I was talking about earlier, they start working with the wrestlers because it's more about making money to survive than it is trying to spread the art. Once you've had a few challenge matches and you've shown that judo or jiu-jitsu can beat a wrestler, you don't really have to continue having challenge matches with everybody where they're legitimate. You can start trying to make money, with big name people, which is what happened most places. So,
Right.
so Taro Miyake, who would eventually become a pro wrestler, he was a Japanese jiu-jitsu black belt, not a judo black belt. So Kosi Maeda, who taught the Gracies, he was a judo black belt, Kodokan black belt. Taro Miyake was a jiu-jitsu black belt. But he came from Japan around the same time all of these guys were going out and spreading the art around the world. And he first lands in England, and he starts working with Yukio Tani, who was Tani, I think, may have been a judo black belt. It's been a while since I looked that up, but I think Tani used to be a judo black belt. And he had established his school in England by wrestling some challenge matches with the catch wrestlers in England. But he was a really small guy, and he lost several of the matches. Miyake's a bigger guy. And when I say bigger, he's 5'8", and he's probably 190 to 200 pounds. But Yukio Tani was like Dr. Kano. He was like 140 pounds or 130 pounds. And so he comes to England, and he establishes himself first by beating Tani in a match I think that they actually worked. And then Miyake kind of became the champion for the jiu-jitsu club, and he would have these challenge matches with these catch wrestlers. And an example of that was in 1904. He wrestled a English catch wrestler, and remember, England had a very well-developed catch wrestling system, at least as early as we did or before, because some of the first top catch wrestlers in the United States were English wrestlers, Edwin Bibby, and more importantly, Joe Acton, the Little Demon. But he wrestled a guy named John Joyce, and for the first 5 minutes or so, you just saw a big pile of arms and legs as these guys struggled to try to get a hold on each other. They were going for submissions, both of them, right from the very beginning. Eventually, Miyake gets catch. So he's trying for an armbar because that's what he beat everybody with initially when he first came to England was he was beating everybody with arm bars, but he couldn't catch Joyce in an armbar because Joyce was just way too wily, and he knew that that's what Miyake would go for. So he had trained with his partners not to get caught in the armbar. So Miyake switched to a footlock, and Joyce submitted to the footlock. One of the things I've never understood is just like with Evan Strangler Lewis, how people used to always say the stranglehold was not a legitimate hold or a fair hold. Fair hold was what they used a lot of times. It's a carotid artery choke. It's perfectly legal. It's a perfectly good submission. To me, as long as the submission works, it's not like you poke somebody in the eye to make this hold work. You put a hold on the person. So this whole rigmarole about, well, it's not a fair hold. Well, it's a submission hold that you could try to defend against, but you weren't able to. So, it's a fair hold. But he complains that the footlock is not a fair hold, like people used to complain about Lewis's stranglehold. So Miyake agrees, okay, well, we'll do this again, and I will either beat you with an armbar or a throw, or I'll be considered the loser. Now, I have no idea if the next match that they had, I think this match was definitely a contest. When you read the newspaper account of this match, there was nothing in it that made me think that it was a work. But they could have been setting up that next match to be a work.
Yeah.
And one of the main reasons I say that is because Miyake came to the United. So Miyake stays in England for 10 years, and he comes to the United States in the mid-teens, 19 teens, and he has a legitimate contest with Ad Santel. He won the first fall. Santel grabbed him in like a side slam and slammed him to the ground so hard that he was knocked out. Miyake was knocked out. And for years, I had heard about Ad Santel defeating a jiu-jitsu guy in 30 seconds, which he did do of the second fall. The first fall went 30 minutes, and Miyake actually won that. They were wearing gis, and I think he did a collar choke on him.
Right.
So this second match with Joyce, that could have been a setup for a worked match. And Miyake, when he came to the United States, he had challenge matches, and he wrestled out of Seattle primarily because that's where his academy was at. I think eventually he realized that he was never going to make enough money as a instructor, and he had a fairly lengthy, almost 20-year wrestling career where he traveled around the United States and would wrestle different guys and obviously worked matches. Although I don't know if he irritated people or he would try to shoot on people every once in a while, but a couple of people, hurt him a couple of times. He was an older guy by this point. He was in his mid 40s, but he got cute with Jim Browning, or Jim Browning didn't like something he did in a match they had in Tennessee, and he put a front face lock on Miyake and squeezed it till no blood came out of his nose. And this was in a match that was worked originally. It started to get a little bit more shootish, more real, but halfway through. But yeah, they were originally working the match.
Right.
And Miyake might be somebody that I write about in the future. He wrestled almost up until his death in 1935, and he was only 55 when he died. He was in his 50s when he died. But so even though the challenge matches and all of that, they had legitimate contests, but they also were working. So there is a long history of working in the U.S., England, and Brazil. And I'm sure if I study any other area, I'll probably find the same thing. Maybe it'd
Right.
be different in India. The Great Gama was from India, and most of now when they came to the U.S., they were probably starting to work because I know the matches that he had one match in London with Stanislaus Zabisco that was a draw, and then he had a second match when they were older and he beat him. Um, his he didn't come to the U.S. I don't think. I have to look into that a little bit more. But he had a brother and some I think other distant relatives that came to the U.S. and they did have wrestling careers, but I think that they ended up working because they came over. Yeah, they had to because when they came over, it was the late 20s, mid 30s, and everybody was pretty much working then, unless it was in a rare agreed upon contest or a double cross in the ring. Because normally, so once we get into the 20s and the 30s, all the wrestlers felt like it was unprofessional to have legitimate contests in front of people. They felt like if we're going to have a legitimate contest, we'll do it in a training match behind closed doors in the gym. And Luthez always said that's where legitimate matches should occur. And one of the reasons is because they can be really boring and turn off fans. So the Stecker Lewis match in 1928, which I think they worked the last two falls in, but they were wrestling legitimately for the first 2 hours of the first fall. It was boring as all get out, and it hurt the box office in St. Louis for months after that until Jim Londas brought the fans back. So whenever you had a
Right.
legitimate contest, I mean, you've seen very boring judo matches. Think of an amateur wrestling match that goes 1 hour with the guys just basically in an upper body tie-up.
Yeah.
You know,
Because at a certain point, like that's a lot of the reason why it ended up getting mixed up as a overglorified strongman contest by some of our colleagues at Taekwondo. It's just
yeah,
because it would just be hours of that, and then, well, not hours, but quite a bit of that, and then actually something happening.
yeah. I mean, I have not watched any of the Taekwondo yet from the Olympics this year because I expect to be disappointed like I have been the last 3 or 4 Olympics. I tell people all the time, if you watch the Olympic Taekwondo, that will give you a false sense of what Taekwondo is like. You would be much better off going to a local tournament and watching those competitions, and you would find that much more exciting. There was some stalling at the local tournaments, like the Ozark qualifier and that, but it was much rarer.
Well, I
You
know
actually
once they
saw good
introduced that
matches.
shove rule, there was quite a bit of shenanigans with that too,
Yeah,
because
I hate that shove rule. I don't know why they came up with that. That should still be a penalty. Because what they're doing is they're allowing people to legally shove somebody back so they're in kicking distance. Well, you can do the same thing with a punch or that double punch Sean loved, and that's what people should
yeah,
be doing. You shouldn't be letting people just shove people all over the place. First of all, you ain't going to shove me. I'll shove
yeah,
you, but you ain't going to shove me.
right,
Because I was showing that to Cirrus. Cirrus has got really long legs. And I told him, you've got to use that to your natural advantage. I said, because if you and I were fighting, here's where I'd be fighting you. And I was 2 inches from his chest. I said, and
right,
when you start to back up, that's when I will punch you and kick you on the way out, and then I'll close that distance again. I said, you can't let me do that. But
right,
yeah, who's going to be shoving me?
yeah, right.
You know, I'm fighting all these 180-pound heavyweights, and I'm 240. You're not going to be shoving me around.
Yeah.
Now, that would be a great rule for me, but I think it's cheap and it's
Oh
stupid.
yeah,
You should be
and you would
punching
just do
your
the
way
C
into that
punch
distance.
anyway, because
Yeah,
that C punch is going to do a lot more good. Like you may end up getting a point just on the shove itself by doing the C punch.
yep, yeah. That's why I'm totally against the shoving. They need to make that illegal again. But I mean, they constantly are messing with the rules of Taekwondo to try to make it more appealing. If you want to make it appealing, do what the judo people did. Penalize them for just standing there looking at each other, because they'll tell them fight 15 times, but they don't ever do it, and they never do anything about it. If you started taking points away, people will start engaging because they're doing it in judo.
Right.
Boy, I don't like a lot of the changes in the rules of Taekwondo, to be honest. I think they've completely destroyed the sport, and they've taken the referees out of it in a lot of respects with the electronic hogus and all of that.
Yeah.
But that has affected the sport because now people have to adapt their tactics to making the things score on these electronic equipment. And at first, there was no sensor in the heel. So you could sidekick all day long and knock them down on the ground, and you weren't going to get a point. Which is what I thought was ridiculous.
Considering that is
I was like,
literally
you need to let the judges, if they see somebody sidekick somebody to where they are off their feet on the ground, because you can get a body knocked down or knocked out, but you're not going to give them a point for that.
But that's the thing about the sidekick as well, is that it is the actual kick. A roundhouse kick, it hurts, but it's like getting slapped with the foot.
Right. It ain't like getting.
It's not like when you get back kicked, front snap kicked, or side kick. It is a full on kick.
Yeah. And I put many people on their butts with that side kick, but I wouldn't have got a point with the electronic hogu system. It makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. But this is supposed to be a pro wrestling podcast, or at least grappling.
Yeah.
We've kind of gone down through the pea patch on the whole Taekwondo thing. So
yeah.
I still think it has value as a sport and as a way to give people an entry into martial arts, because there's TKD schools all over the place. But I think they need to diversify their curriculum and make sure they're including a little grappling, a little self-defense at least in there for their students. Right. I've kind of got off the topic of what. So we covered the working in Taro Miyake's career, and I did want to cover that double cross that I had sent you. Any other thoughts about this topic that I covered?
Specifically, my ADHD may have made me forget what we were.
We're just talking about Miyake and how the jiu-jitsu guys came and made it in judo and made those challenges to kind of spread their art, but then pretty quickly they started working as well because it was about revenue generation and helping supplement their income as martial arts instructors so they could eat, as opposed to
which is
the only person I've ever heard of that issued those challenges that never worked was Elio. And George Gracie, who was the family champion before Elio, they don't talk about him, but he had an exemplary record in Brazil, and he won those challenge matches, but then he ended up working as well because he made a lot more money working with his opponents than he did just beating them all. And he did not get along with Carlos, so because he didn't get along with Carlos, he ended up not getting along with Elio, who's only 2 years younger than him. They were very close in age, and from what I've read, were pretty tight at one time. But he was on the outs with both Carlos and Elio, but he told people, my brother Elio never took a worked match. All of his matches were legitimate. So, and Elio fought one of the people that we're going to talk about in our review. He fought Kimura in Brazil about 3 years before that match with Rikidozan that we're going to review. He took on Elio in 51, and he broke Elio's arm in that challenge match with the Kimura lock. So when they challenged Kimura, we'll go Elio first, then we'll talk about the match we're going to review. Kimura challenged Elio, but Elio wanted it to be where throws and pins could not end the contest. It had to be a submission, because that's what they practiced. That's what they were really good at. And Kimura agreed to it. And Kimura threw the heck out of Elio. Elio tried to throw Kimura, but Kimura is considered the greatest judo player of all time. So if Rickson Gracie is the greatest jiu-jitsu player of all time, Kimura was the greatest judo player. He was promoted to 7th Dan on his competition record by the time he was 30 years old. But he has been so he should be a 10th Dan posthumously, but he had a falling out with the Kodokan not long after they promoted him to 7th Dan. So he was frozen at 7th Dan in his lifetime, and he died in the 1990s. He was born in 1917. And to this day, he's still a 7th Dan. But people will tell you, before Kimura, there was no Kimura. After Kimura, there was no Kimura. He is still to this day, with all the people that have practiced judo, still considered the greatest to have ever done judo. I think he lost 4 judo matches in his entire career in 1935. That's it. So he takes on Elio. He's in his mid-30s. He's like 34. Elio's 42 when they have their match. And no, he wasn't. Elio was born in 1913. He was 38. So he's 38. Kimura's 34. Kimura is heavier. Elio and him, I think Elio's taller. Barely. Because Elio was not that tall. He was 5'8", 5'7", 5'8". Kimura was 5'7", 185. And so he's throwing Elio around. But, he's not going to win that way. He's just trying to wear him out. And then he caught him in that Kimura lock, and he broke it in 2 places because Elio wouldn't tap. And finally, Carlos threw the towel in. So that was 3 years before the match we're going to talk about next. When Kimura goes back to Japan, he is on the outs with the Kodokan, and he can't officially teach judo. So he starts getting involved in professional wrestling because he's been doing these challenge matches, all around the world with different wrestlers and judo players and all that. And he comes into an agreement with Rikidozan because Kimura has started his own professional wrestling league, as has Rikidozan. And Rikidozan is really the person who popularizes and establishes professional wrestling in Japan. There really wasn't professional wrestling before Rikidozan. He was a trained sumo wrestler who felt he was never going to get to where he needed to be because he was part Korean. And so he started training to be a pro wrestler, and he became friends with Lou Thez. And Lou Thez wrestled a 1-hour draw with him in Japan that was televised. I think millions of homes, maybe. I mean, it was a really big deal. But after that 1-hour draw with Thez, he was established as the guy, and he was the first big star. And so he's putting professional wrestling on the map. He and Kimura agree to have this match, which was in 1954, and this is a big deal. So you're talking about kind of the matinee idol, pro wrestling first superstar in the country going against the greatest judoka who ever lived. Kimura is 37 now, and 36, 37, depending on when this match was in 1954. And Rikidozan is 29 or 30. There's a 7-year difference between the two of them. Dozan was born and Rikidozan was born in 1924. Kimura is born in 1917. According to Kimura, and if you look at this match, I think that what he's saying is absolutely true. He had agreed to work a match with Rikidozan that was going to end in a draw. And then they were going to wrestle. That was going to set up a series of matches between the two of them for the world title, recognized in Japan. However, as we saw in the match, that's not quite how it came out. So that match went about 15 minutes, I'd say.
Yeah, I think it was closer. No, it was 15 because there was the little. A lot of that was the pre and post fight drama stuff. I don't know how to describe that.
Yeah. The build up, the publicity, and then the actual match starts, because it's a 2-part video, and I'll put the links up at kenzermanjr.com/episode 62. But yeah, there was 2 parts to the video. The double cross happens in the second video, which is about 5 minutes long. And to me, it looked like they were just having a normal match up to the point where Rikidozan looks like he's going to slap him. And you see Kimura kind of flinching and getting both hands up. Kimura also had a little bit of a karate background, too. The weight difference here is significant. So Kimura weighs 185, Rikidozan weighs 243. And
Yeah.
Rikidozan's 2 inches tall, 5'9", at least that's what Kimura. So if Dozan's lying about his height, so is Kimura.
Yeah.
When did you think did you think Kimura suspected Dozan was going to double cross him?
I don't think so, because there was like legitimate shock, and whenever it just suddenly turned into a punching match. And
Yeah,
I think like by the time he had registered that he was getting double crossed, it was too late because he'd already been hit in the head a couple times.
Yeah, I thought that he was trying to back off Dozan right before Dozan started shooting on him, when he kind of kicked at him, because he threw that kind of weak front kick at him, but it looked like he was trying to hit him with it. But it looked like he was trying to back off Dozan to say, like, what's going on?
Right.
And one of the things I picked up on in that video right away, the referee was in on the fact that Rikidozan was going to double cross him.
Oh, yeah.
Because if you see when he throws that kick, and it's not a very good kick, it doesn't hit where it's supposed to hit. The referee warns him about kicking Rikidozan. And while he's warning, then Rikidozan starts slapping him.
Yeah.
And then Rikidozan kicks him in the stomach once or twice, and then kicks him flat in the face. But when he first kicks him in the stomach the first time, Kimura looks at the referee like, "Hey, you said we can't kick," and the referee like waves it off like, "No, that's fine." And he kicks him in the stomach again, and the referee says nothing. And then he kicks him in the face and drags him to the middle of the ring and starts slapping him and hitting him. And you could tell, but at that point in time, now Kimura knows something's going on, but I think he was just too dazed at that point to do anything about it. But the referee definitely knew that was going to happen, because he didn't react at all. He just acted like the match was, still going on.
Yeah, no. If I hadn't been informed that it was a double cross or whatever, I'd have looked at the ref and been like, "This guy's an idiot."
Yeah, no, that referee was definitely in on it. Because he made no reactions like you would if you were surprised that was going on. And if anything, he was aiding and abetting Rikidozan in the double cross.
Yeah.
And those guys never wrestled again. But one of the reasons I wanted to cover that is one of the very few double crosses you'll see in the modern era. There were actually 2 in WWE. So I'm sure you've heard of the Montreal Screwjob, which was really a double cross, where they talked to Brett before the match and have him let Shawn put him in the sharpshooter, and then Vince has the referee ring the bell immediately, like Bret Hart submitted to that. That's a double cross, because Bret didn't want to lose the match to Shawn. But they couldn't do a traditional double cross like Rikidozan did, because if Shawn Michaels tried to shoot on Bret Hart would have kicked the piss out of him in front of everybody that was watching the pay-per-view,
Right.
and made Vince's world champion look like a big putz. So that's why they did that one that way. They kind of did the same thing in the 1980s because it looked bad, and you're like, what the heck? Wendy Richter was the women's world champion. And I don't know if she had some kind of conflict with Vince, she wasn't
Which
going to be
all
uh,
things that are coming out now would
right
not
about
be
Vince.
shocking.
Wendy Richter probably would have told Vince if Vince said, "Hey, would you like to go to my private gym?" She'd have told Vince, "Vince, I will whoop you up one side," and she could have done it. Wendy Richter
Yeah.
was almost 6 foot tall and very athletic, and she could have given Vince a run for his money. So I don't think he wanted to test her at all. But whatever reason they had a falling out, she's in a match with the Spider Lady, who had been somebody else. Well, it turns out the Spider Lady is the fabulous Moolah, which Wendy Richter knows right away because she knows Moolah. She used to work for her. But they're having this match, and Moolah gets a small cradle on Wendy Richter, and referee counts 1, 2. Wendy kicks out, counts 3, and awards the title to Spider Lady. And everybody in the world could see clearly that she had not pinned Wendy. Well, Wendy gets mad, unmasks the Spider Lady to show everybody it's Moolah, knocks Moolah on the ground, and then puts Moolah in a cradle that Moolah cannot get out of. And Wendy Richter counts 3 and then lets her go. But that was a double cross. But those are so rare after when the National Wrestling Alliance comes into being in the 1940s. There was a double cross outside of the NWA in 1960 over the AWA title, not the Vern Gagne AWA title, but the Boston AWA title. There was a double cross there. There was this one in 1954, and then there were those two in the WWE. But double crosses are very, very rare after the National Wrestling Alliance is formed in 1948, because if you double crossed and tried to shoot on the world champion, you were not going to be booked anywhere in the NWA territory, which was most of the big promotions in the United States. And if you shot on the NWA champion, it's highly unlikely that the AWA or the WWF, the other big promotions, well, WWWF at the time, would book you either. So the
Right.
formation of the National Wrestling Alliance pretty much ended the whole practice of the double cross, which was rife in the 1920s and the 1930s. There were all kinds of double crosses in the ring, and they all looked bad. You'll hear people talk about double crosses, or they don't talk about double crosses. They'll talk about people shooting. Oh, they're shooting. They're wrestling legitimately. No. Every example I've seen in the modern era when somebody tells me people are shooting, they're not shooting. They're not wrestling legitimately trying to beat each other. They get pissed in the middle of a match and they stop cooperating and they start beating each other up. That's not shooting. That's unprofessional behavior. That is, people not cooperating with each other, but that's not shooting. The outcome of that match is not going to change. That's not what's going on there.
Right.
So what did you think of the match before that?
The match as itself,
Rikidozan and Kimura.
astonishingly, I thought Rikidozan was doing better. Now I could have been looking at the wrong. No, I think I had it right. It
No.
seemed like no, because I was gonna say the black pants was Rikidozan.
Yep. The bigger
Like just
guy is
casually
Dozan with the long
observing.
black pants.
Yeah, just casual like observing. It just seemed like he had more control of the match, but
He did. He looked very strong in that, and I think he did that on purpose because I think that he was wanting to use that match to really solidify
in his
himself as the
career,
only top guy in Japan. So
right?
Rikidozan was actually murdered 7 years later in 1961. He was in a club and he was drinking, and so the Yakuza have always been rumored to be involved with all the big sports promotions in Japan. So, they had a
Yeah,
piece of New Japan, they had a piece of All Japan. And a lot of it is you're not going to be able to do business in Japan if you're not doing business with them a lot of times because just like in the United States, they have controls of unions and things like that. So even if you're not dropping off a suitcase with the leader of the local yakuza, you are paying people in a building who are giving money to the yakuza. And this was even true with Pride Fighting Championships. The yakuza are, a lot of them are very wealthy, and they look for things to invest in just like any other business. And so
Right.
they will invest a lot in those sports businesses as well.
Right.
So Rikidozan was, and there's always, because of how he was killed, that he had ticked off the yakuza, and this is, were behind him being killed. Maybe, maybe not. Rikidozan was full of himself, and when he had been drinking, he could be a handful. Well, he got drunk this night in this nightclub. I think it might have been his nightclub. I'm most positive it was his nightclub. But he had been drinking, and a local yakuza guy was there. Not a big wig. He's a soldier, small timer, and he
Yeah.
somehow he's not a big guy. He's a small guy. Dozan's a big guy. So Rikidozan took some kind of offense at this guy and slapped the crap out of him and threw him out of the bar. Well, this same guy comes back later with a dagger reportedly soaked in urine and stabs Rikidozan multiple times. Well, Dozan does not die from the stab wounds. They think he might have survived that, but the urine on the blade gave him a blood infection, and that's what killed him. And his medical treatment was delayed by a couple hours because he always fancied himself a really tough guy. He did not
Yeah.
go to the hospital right away after being stabbed by this guy. He hung around the nightclub and was talking to people, and as people tried to beg him to go to the hospital, which he eventually did. But
Yeah.
supposedly that the guy had pissed on that dagger, which gave him blood poisoning. He
That
probably would have
is.
still survived. Now they've got antibiotics and stuff that can take care of the blood poisoning. That's what killed a lot of people. People had survivable wounds
Yeah.
in the late 1900s, the late 1800s, early 1900s. But they would get blood infections, and that's what would kill them. They'd call it blood poisoning, and that's
Yeah.
what killed them a lot of times. There was a police officer who was shot in the wrist in St. Louis in 1893, and he just went home with a bandage on his wrist. And everybody thought, man, no big deal. He's going to recover in a few days. And about a week later, his arm started swelling up, and he wasn't feeling good. He goes to the hospital, and he had blood poisoning, and there was nothing they could do about it because there was no antibiotic that could treat that at the time. Now it's a couple of pills, and it'll take care of it. But yeah, back then,
Right.
death sentence. It was like getting
Right.
tuberculosis before they had the modern treatment. Tuberculosis with a death sentence. Now it could be treated with antibiotics.
Right.
So, but yeah, Rikidozan was a huge star in Japan, and still a bit of a national hero. The whole manner of his death has kind of put a cloud not over him, but over the circumstances. Was it a yakuza hit? Did he just make this guy really mad that he had beat up? You know,
I'm sure it was the latter. Like,
the circumstances seem to argue for that. If the yakuza was going to kill Rikidozan, I don't think
they
they'd
would
send
do it
a low-level
way
soldier.
more silently.
Yeah, they're not going to send a low-level soldier in there to get beat up by him at first and then come back. And so I've never really put much stock in the yakuza killing him theory. But it's pro wrestling. Everything gets blown up and things like that. So I think that's why
Yeah.
it has had some
Martial arts
cachet.
mythology.
Yeah, it's had some cachet with some people, but I just don't. I think it was much more revenge for being beaten up. And the world that soldier was in, if he let Rikidozan beat him up and toss him out of the bar and he didn't do anything, he would not probably have been around much longer. That's a shark eat shark world in there.
Yeah.
Now Kimura, he lived a nice ripe old age. But he never did make peace with the Kodokan, and I don't know who is more to blame for that, Kimura or the Kodokan.
Yeah, because that's the other thing is like these organizations aren't untouchable. Like we had this sort of thing with the Kukiwan a while back too.
I mean, who would think that one of these national or one of these international organizations could be hidebound by tradition and not,
Yeah,
be more feeling or something? I mean, no, you wouldn't imagine that would happen, would you?
yeah, no.
Well, believe it or not, we have gone almost an hour. Is there anything else you want to add?
I don't have anything off the top of my head. The only thing I would add is that I think what happened was because Kimura, like the reason why I probably thought Kimura didn't do as well was because he was probably taking it easy, thinking it was just going to be a usual work, wasn't going to have to do a ton. But Ricky was trying to dominate the match and like try to make it appear that it wasn't a work and that he rightfully earned that. Because that's the only other reason why I could think of why he looked like he actually came out on top, despite Kimura actually being able to beat the Gracies in other legitimate contests.
Yeah, Rikidozan knew what he was going to do the whole time. That's the classic definition of the double cross, because people will sometimes mix double cross and shoots up. A shoot is when both of us going in know this is going to be a legitimate contest that we're wrestling.
Right.
It's a competition. We know that we're going to go in and we're wrestling for real. A double cross is when only one of us knows that's going to happen. I mean, that's the classic definition of a double cross.
Right.
And so it makes a lot of sense why Rikidozan looked so strong in the beginning of the match, because he knew about what point in time he was going to double cross Kimura, and so he came out of that match looking super strong.
Right.
So I think the next episode is probably going to be just me and your uncle, but since looks like he's finally coming home, we have wanted you guys to sit down and not watch the whole event necessarily, but watch a few matches from one of the big events and just get your perspective, because a lot of the listeners like your and Caleb's perspective on wrestling, because you're not wrestling fans. You definitely weren't wrestling fans as kids. You've only started watching some of it since you've been doing the podcast with us. So some of the people have written in and said it's interesting to get your guys' perspective, because you're not traditional wrestling fans. You didn't grow up on it. It's all kind of a new world for you guys. So my hope still is the next big event will be Survivor Series. We missed SummerSlam. So the next big event is Survivor Series, which is around Thanksgiving time. So if it works out with your uncle's schedule and your guys' schedule, because they're usually on Sunday night, we'll sit down and watch a couple of the matches from Peacock. We'll make sure they're good ones. We won't make you sit through the bad ones, although under Triple H, it's been much better. There have been very few bathroom matches since he's taken over. So, whereas most of them used to be bathroom matches before that.
Yeah.
So, if you don't have anything else, I think that we will put this episode to bed. We will be back. I think we're going to be back next week. I think Dan and I are going to release an episode on Labor Day. We'll see how that turns out. And for Trey and I, we wish everybody a good week and come back and see us next time. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.